Hi birders, welcome back to part 2 of my video, birding without binoculars or birding by ear. You know, many birders, including myself, predominantly bird by ear when we go out and bird. And we find lots of birds just by knowing the sounds and the calls of those birds. Now there are many advantages to having that skill. First is that you can find birds more easily. If you know their calls and songs and you can identify them, you don't have to look in the dense vegetation and try and find all the field marks to see that bird. So you can be able to identify a lot more birds as you're going on in your birding day. The second thing is that sounds travel farther than being where you can see a bird. So you can identify birds from farther away. By knowing that call or that song, you can identify something that's totally out of sight that you would have just missed if you didn't have your birding by ear skills. Third, you can identify birds that are usually in places where you can't see them. Birds that like to skulk around in, say, grasses, some of the grassland birds, rails in a marsh where you generally can't see them, but they'll be calling in the springtime and you can identify them by their call. So that's another great advantage. And finally, in some cases, being able to identify birds by ear is the only way to do that for some species. For example, the Repetitio flycatchers. They look totally alike. The field marks aren't going to be any different, but their songs are different. So you can easily separate like willow and alder flycatcher just by knowing their songs. So I titled the video Birding Without Binoculars really to get your attention and perhaps pique your interest in how you would be able to bird without binoculars. But of course, when we go out birding, the reason we do that is because we love going out and finding birds and watching them, and seeing them is part of the whole process of birding. So although I say go out birding without binoculars and just listen to sounds, you always have to bring your binoculars when you're in the field because that's just the joy of birding. So with that, let's get on with part 2 of the video and get on to learning how to bird by ear. Welcome to part 2 of the video. I'm Joe, the Springbrook birder for the DuPage Birding Club. Part 1 of the video, I covered some of the basic information regarding bird calls and song. Now we'll talk about how to get started on your path being an expert in using bird calls and songs as an additional identification tool. How can you learn to distinguish bird calls and become a birding by ear birder? After all, we have about 250 species of birds recorded in DuPage County every year. Learning all those different bird calls and songs seems like an overwhelming task. Well, this part of the video provides a path to follow so that you will be able to identify birds by ear. The first step is just making yourself aware of the bird sounds around you. I think that many birders simply are not listening for birds out in the field. You need to attune both your mind and your ears to listening as well as seeing. Always be on the alert to any bird songs or calls when you are out birding. Next, bird calls in the same way that you learned how to identify birds by sight. ID skills did not happen overnight. It likely took some investment in time and resources. You can go through the same process, just use your hearing instead of seeing. Good idea is to familiarize yourself with bird songs and calls for the species in your local area. Start out small and gradually increase your range. No sense in learning the song of a cactus wren or a Kalima warbler if you are only birding in Illinois. The first step to start out learning easy calls and songs of the most common and familiar birds in your local area. These will be the vocalizations that you will hear most often, and it's really good to learn them first. So how do you get started learning any song? As I indicated, start out with listening to and learning the bird calls and songs you hear every day, in your yard, at your feeder, along the trails of the forest reserve. Recordings of bird songs and calls are a great way to familiarize yourself with the sounds made by different species. There is an incredible amount of information and resources out there, both online and in portable apps. You don't need to have a record player or try to find a Roger Tory Peterson vinyl set at a garage sale or the DuPage Birding Club auction. A key point, I think, connect the sounds that you hear to a specific bird. At first, when you're out in the field and you hear a sound, try and see the bird that is singing or calling. The simultaneous audio and visual connection helps your brain make and remember the association between the sound and the name of the bird. I find that hearing and seeing the bird at the same time really helps me recall that information at a later date. When you go out birding in the springtime, you will likely hear many calls and songs at the same time. Carefully listen to bird sounds and try to isolate a single song that you hear. Locate where it is coming from and carefully listen and notice the different components of the song that you are hearing. Is the pitch of the song high or low? What's the tone of the song? Is it primarily buzzy, clear like a whistle, a low rumble, harsh or soft? Is there a distinctive rhythm to the song? Is it fast or slow? Does it have a steady tempo? Is it steady and monotonous notes? Or is it a song filled with variation? How about the length of the song? For a particular song, focus on its key components and differences that will help you separate this song from others. A good idea is to go out and learn from an experienced birder who knows bird songs and calls. We all know that birders love to share their knowledge, so it helps if you can learn some calls and songs from an expert. Join and attend the DuPage Birding Club field trip. There's lots of friendly expertise and help there. Finally, practice, practice, practice. As the nuns in my Catholic elementary school used to say, repetitio est mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of learning. Good advice even today when learning bird song. Some birders find it helpful and useful to use mnemonics to remember bird calls. Mnemonics are little phrases that try to mimic or translate a bird song into words. There are some examples. For the chickadee, it's chickadee-dee-dee. For white-throated sparrow, many people, it sounds like the bird is singing Old Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. And for the barred owl, it's who cooks for you? For many, mnemonics are a little trick that you can use to help you remember what a particular species sounds like. You can find many such phrases in aids online or in field guides. And I believe there is even a book of mnemonics out there. When you are starting out, begin by learning easy and recognizable songs. You might even find out that you already know many songs when you hear them. Examples of sounds that you already likely know include the mourning dove, red-winged blackbird, and I'm sure you know red-tailed hawk. You've probably heard this many times. Each of those calls is diagnostic, and I think easily recognizable when you hear them. You need to build your skills over time. Knowing all the songs and calls takes time and some effort on your part. Again, it's worth mentioning that repetition and finding singing birds in the field are the ways to learn and remember those sound, sight, name associations. As your skills progress, tackle more difficult separations, such as the difference between the rose-breasted grosbeak and the American robin. This is the rose-breasted grosbeak call. And now the robin. Song of those two species sound very similar. But if you listen carefully, I think you can tell that the grosbeak is more of a pure whistle and has less raspy qualities. Sometimes grosbeak will make its characteristic ping sound, which is really diagnostic. That can seal the deal of the ID if you are not sure. Listening to recordings of bird songs and calls is also very helpful. Recordings can be used in two ways. First, you can listen to them to become familiar with the sounds of birds that you can expect to see. At times, after listening to the recordings and then hearing a song in the field, you'll be able to recall that sound and trigger a correct identification of the species. Second, you can hear something when you're out birding that you don't recognize or that you're not sure as to the species ID. You can then go back and play recordings of birds that you think it might be and verify the ID by hearing the identical sound on the recording. There are a great number of excellent recordings of bird sounds today, not only for Illinois, but for North America and even worldwide. A great source of audio recordings is the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology All About Birds website. Cornell also has a downloadable version that you can purchase, Guide to Bird Sounds, United States and Canada. In addition, there are now many bird ID apps available that include bird calls and songs. You can upload them right to your phone and have quick access to songs and calls right in the field. Finally, some people find spectrograms useful. Spectrograms are graphic presentations that provide a visualization of bird songs and calls. Spectrograms can be useful and helpful by providing a visual clue as to what a bird sounds like, especially if your brain is skilled at transforming the visual graphic into sound. Here are examples of spectrograms for several different species of thrushes. I think you can see, for example, that the thrushes have different types of songs. And some of you might even be able to hear those songs in your mind when you see the spectrograms. So how can you use your new knowledge of bird sounds and birding by ear skills in the field? You can use sounds to separate species that are difficult to tell apart visually. For example, the alder and willow flycatchers essentially look the same, and it is virtually impossible to tell the two species apart in the field, unless you know the songs. This is the song of the alder flycatcher. And this is the willow flycatcher. The alder sounds like it's singing Thebio, and the willow sing Fitzbute. Easy ID separation through song. You'll be able to ID birds from far away. Here's the calls of the sandhill crane. You can hear that call from long distance. And I am often alerted to migrating sandhill cranes flying high overhead by that distinctive call. Another of my favorite bird sounds. You can find and identify secretive species that hunker down in dense vegetation. It may be impossible or very difficult to actually see some species. You might end up spending much of your morning trying to get a glimpse of them. But if you are birding by ear, you'll easily identify them and record their presence. As an example, this is the call of the morning warbler. It's a late spring migrant that normally is found in dense shrubby vegetation, but it has a very distinctive call. Also, there's Henslow sparrow. Henslow's is a species that likes to stay low in the thick grasses, but you can hear that distinctive C-lick call from quite a distance away. You can accurately identify more species quickly using birding by ear. If you know the calls and songs, you do not need to spend a lot of time having to see all those minutia field marks. Sorry, Dennis. A quick listen for that unique song is all you need. So you can impress your friends and win friendly competitions. Finally, if you get to know the calls and songs of all the usual birds, when you hear something that you do not recognize or know, it might be an unusual or new species for you. So birding by ear can help you find those rarities that can show up anytime you bird. A couple cautionary notes are needed regarding your journey to identifying birds through songs and calls. First, you need to recognize that there is a great deal of variation in bird songs. That variation takes several forms. There's individual variation in song. That is, a particular bird within a species may sing a slightly different song than another individual of the same species. It just sounds different due to individual variation. There is broad geographic variation. Birds in northern Illinois might have a different dialect than birds of the same species along the Texas coast. You should be aware of that when traveling, or if by chance one of those birds from another area shows up here. Then some species have alternate songs and calls. That is, all birds within a single species may normally sing a different version of its song. As an example, listen to the following two recordings. Both of those songs are from northern Parula warblers. Same species, two songs that are very different. Also have to keep in mind that there are mimics out there. We are all aware of mockingbirds and the fact that they incorporate the songs of many species into their own. But there are also species, such as starlings, that mimic a variety of other species. Blue jays make a great red-shouldered hawk call. So if something sounds a little off, consider it that it might be a mimic, or perhaps even another birder making calls. The way to address those issues is to try to recognize key components of a song through that variation that you're hearing. Song sparrows have a great variety of songs. Several key components and structures of the song usually are present so that you can still recognize it as a song sparrow. And just so that you do not think birding by ear is a slam dunk and easy ID method, there are some species with very similar songs that are very difficult to separate, even for the experienced and well-schooled birder. Here's an example: scarlet tanager and the summer tanager. First, the scarlet tanager. Now the summer tanager. They are very close. When you're out in the field, they're often difficult to separate. Now, to me, scarlet sounds a bit more raspy, and that's a good thing to think about when you're trying to separate those two species. So, birding by ear is not very mysterious. It is simply using sounds that birds make as another tool to identify them. It adds another dimension to birding, so that in addition to seeing birds, you can also enjoy them in the field. As with any other skill or know-how, becoming proficient in birding by ear takes knowledge, repetition, and field practice to achieve success. And remember, always investigate those unknown and unfamiliar bird calls and songs. Following that call that I did not recognize led me to find the first blue grosbeak ever recorded at Springbrook Prairie. Similarly, Bob Fisher heard this sound one day when walking through Springbrook. That turned out to be a rare black rail. Both species were found and identified by their calls and songs. Birds that certainly would have been missed by a birder without knowledge of calls and songs. So you will be a better birder and be able to locate and identify more birds more quickly using your birding by ear skills. It adds another facet to enjoying birding whenever you bird. I'll leave you again with this song. I bet that if you hear that song out in the field in the future, you'll remember that is the song of the hermit thrush. I hope you enjoyed the video. For the DuPage Birding Club, I'm Joe the Springbrook Birder. Bird with a purpose.